Right, well, I'm sorry, this is going to be a whistle-stop tour of stuff, but if we're going to talk about prosperity growth, we might want to understand a little bit about what economic growth is. So economic growth is broadly a measure of the increase in economic activity in a country. It's typically measured using gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is a monetary measure of the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a period of time. That's to say that every time anybody pays for a finished good or service, that price is paid to GDP. That means, for instance, if a baker buys flour in order to bake bread, the price the customer pays for the bread is added to GDP, but the price the baker paid for the flour is not directly. Of course, that price of that flour is contained within the price of the bread, and so it's counted in that way, and this stops double counting. That means, for example, that the sale of second-hand goods is not included in GDP, but for instance, services that charge for selling those things, so for example, eBay fees or postage costs or anything like that would count towards GDP. GDP is an imperfect measure as it does not count non-monetary productivity. So if you fix your own bike or car or grow your own veg, bake your own bread, then that does not count towards GDP. There are many valid criticisms of GDP, but on the whole, this is a good measure of our standard of living as opposed to our well-being. Well-being and standard of living are linked, however, but with diminishing returns to well-being from increased standards of living. So when I talk about growth from now on, what I mean is percentage growth in the GDP figure. So why does this even matter? There are three quite important suppositions. The first is that our current levels of resource consumption is producing undesirable effects like habitat and biodiversity loss, carbon emissions, pollution, other side effects of material extraction, and as such resource consumption needs to decrease. The second is that the quantity of resources consumed is linked or coupled to GDP. And that rising GDP is necessary for economic and hence social stability. And this presents us with a bit of a dilemma. If we continue to grow, then we may continue to increase our already undesirable environmental impact even further. If we attempt to lower our consumption and hence GDP, then we seem certain to cause economic problems. It is also worth stating that broadly there are two reasons to worry about consumption. One is running out of materials like fossil fuels, and the second is environmental impacts. When we discuss this topic, we should be clear which of these two concerns we care about, for our different weightings of those concerns can lead us to different conclusions. For me, the environmental impacts are probably the bigger of my concerns. So, is growth necessary for a stable economy? Or why is growth necessary for a stable economy? There are a few factors that affect the rate of growth, but primarily growth is driven by labour productivity. That is to say, the amount of output a single person can produce in a unit of time. We also have a competitive market which rewards production of goods for the lowest price and does not easily accommodate other values, such as land stewardship or workers' conditions, etc. This means that when productivity increases through better knowledge, tools, machinery or automation, either unemployment rises or new employment has to be found through increased novelty, i.e. meeting needs that did not previously exist or could not previously be met, or increased consumption of things that we already consume. Without growth, then employment rates will fall. Tax take will fall, and at the same time, demands on the welfare state will increase, just at the time it can least afford it. Services provided through taxation, including things like unemployment benefit and the NHS, will become very difficult to pay for, which is concerning. This means that we're faced with two options. We can either work out a way to deal with the degrowth scenario, learning to deal with the social problems that might arise, or we try to decouple our resource use from growth and carry on as before. By the way, zero growth or steady state won't do. We already have too large an impact on our environment. So is decoupling possible? To understand this, we need to look a bit closer at the decoupling concepts. And there are two types of decoupling. The first is relative decoupling. This is a lowering of resource usage per unit output. Or absolute decoupling, and this is lower resource usage overall. It is the second of these, absolute decoupling, that we're after. We're quite good at relative decoupling. It is rewarded within our market economy, but sadly, relative decoupling does not necessarily lead to absolute decoupling. Here we meet the rebound effect. In instances where efficiency increases, we typically find that overall consumption ends up increasing too. To use more of that which has become cheaper as a result of greater efficiency. This means that despite fewer resources being consumed per unit output, the number of units consumed increases, raising overall resource use. There are sometimes limits to this, and this is called demand saturation. For example, calories consumed saturates quite quickly. However, we need to be careful when thinking in this way because, for instance, increased food novelty can continue long after calorie demand has been saturated. Consumers may get access to ever more sophisticated foods, for example, exotic fruits shipped from around the world, out-of-season produce grown in greenhouses, or processed ready meals that not only fulfill calories but aid convenience. There are some schools of thought that say we should just keep on growing to get the efficiency benefits and demand will eventually saturate. However, we should not be naive about this for 3 reasons. First, it might turn out to be true that demand will saturate. We don't yet know for sure, especially with regard to energy demand. Efficiencies also have practical limits. For example, air travel is not going to get significantly more efficient. It is already near to physical limits, and there's a certain amount of energy you have to expend in order to keep a plane in the air. One of the driving forces behind the second is that one of the driving forces behind our current economic systems is increased novelty, specifically creating demand that was not once present. So the idea that we will necessarily just saturate our demand is perhaps foolish. Our current levels and the third is that our current levels of resource use are already too high, and it is far from clear that we're close to saturation. And if demand does saturate across the board, will we still have a growing economy? I don't know the answer to that. Even in the metric we're trying hardest to decouple, carbon emissions, we are making little progress. The evidence suggests that there has been no decoupling of CO2 emissions at the global level. Global CO2 emissions are rising again after a period of stagnation, and the only absolute decrease in emissions being around the financial crash in 2008, demonstrating strongly the coupling between growth and carbon emissions, despite significant increases in efficiency. There are some examples of decoupling from natural resource use through substitution for specific measures, but these often come with ugly trade-offs. For example, raising yields on existing farmland has allowed total crop production to go up more than 3-fold since 1961, while cropland area is expanded out by only 13%. But that has side effects like cattle in feedlots fed by soybeans from deforested land and pesticide use resulting in the collapse of insect populations. So my tentative view is this, that decoupling all our environmental impacts at once from growth is at least very unlikely, and that we have an uphill struggle to do it even for carbon emissions. Remember, at a 2% growth rate, our energy use will double in 35 years. So it's not today's energy use we must decarbonise. By 2050, we need a carbon-free source of energy for twice that amount used in 2015. So what might future economies look like? What happens if we are forced into a degrowth scenario and cannot rely on government support and large-scale infrastructure needed in our globalised world? Should ideas of local resilience, community building, rebuilding the household and local economies, gift economies, and charity gain more importance? What of the big society that was the buzzword during the financial crisis? On the other hand, so far I've assumed that the past will look like the future, but perhaps there are ways to respin our economy so that we still grow an abstract number but have a falling resource consumption. Ideas like the circular economy often come up, but we should also ask if these are really silver bullets in terms of growth and resource consumption. For example, the circular economy has an emphasis on reselling, repairing and recycling. The first two of those don't add greatly to GDP, and people often expect recycled things to be cheaper. So while all of these ideas are excellent, will they, if implemented, still lead to degrowth? The other idea is the shorter working week, or choosing to use more labour-intensive methods of production to avoid workers being made redundant. But a potential problem here is that in our globalised economy, enterprises which choose to do this will be undercut in terms of price. It also implies that us having fewer, more expensive things or being paid less. And unless a culture of working less is ingrained or legislated for, it would be unstable, leading workers to outcompete one another, to work longer hours in order to have higher incomes, at least if work or pay is felt to be scarce. When considering solutions to our dilemma, we should be mindful that corporations exist in a market economy that forces them to be price efficient, to make their products at least as cheap as their direct competitors. This means that using more expensive, environmentally gentler ways is fundamentally discouraged. We will need to protect businesses holding themselves to higher standards, either through legislation so that their markets are protected from less environmentally gentle businesses, through tariffs or environmental standards, or through loyalty by buying their more expensive product anyway. We ought to, if we can, value things not just based on their cost, but on their benefits too, to account for social and environmental benefits that come with a product that may sometimes be more expensive. We're quite used to this way of thinking. People buy Ferraris because they are fast, not because they're cheap. The trick is to recognise the value not just to oneself, but to the wider community and the environment. Perhaps seen in this way, the market economy still has a place. The question of how we get appropriate information on products, on a product's impact, or how we might be encouraged to care about those impacts is up for discussion. But maybe it is one more reason to rebuild a local economy.
Thank you, Gareth.